Hi everybody, welcome back to PCS 101. This is for our class for Thursday, February 9th. And as you know, basically I'm trying to duplicate what we would do if we were in an in-person class. So every Thursday by 6 p.m., though I'm going to try to post the videos before then, you'll have a class video where I'm talking about what I would have talked about in class. And then there is an attendance question for you to respond to, which would try to duplicate what it is that we would be doing in a class discussion. And I give you 48 hours to respond to that attendance question, but certainly ask me for an extension if you aren't able to do that within 48 hours. You're not required to respond to your classmates, though certainly you can, but you are required to read your classmates' responses and my responses in turn, because I'll be responding to all of you. So that would help to simulate the kind of classroom conversation that we would have had. And as I indicated, I put most of the readings from the textbook up front at the beginning of the semester so that the second part of the semester could be about performing the actual speeches themselves. And we're getting ready for our first speech, which happens to be an autobiographical speech, where I'm giving you 5 minutes to talk a little bit about yourself. Whether you wanted to give a life overview in 5 minutes, obviously you would just focus on highlights. Or whether or not what you wanted to do was to focus on a particular time period or a particular element of your life. Suggested that if you're not quite sure what to discuss, you might want to talk about education, because it's the one thing we all share, whether it's reviewing your educational history or talking about your educational present and how you ended up in this particular class and why, or your educational future and your goals. You could talk about a hobby or an activity or a person that's of great importance to you. Just keep in mind that the subject of the speech is not about them, it's about you and how that thing or person helps us understand you better. So at the ending of the speech, we should have a little bit more of a sense of who you are so we can get to know our classmates a little bit. But also you'll be able to put into place many of the suggestions that we've been reviewing about how to put together a speech. And you'll remember we began with the Toastmasters video, which basically gave us a kind of overview of the entire speech process. Then we moved to some of the chapters in the textbook. And the chapters for today are about organizing and outlining, beginning and ending, and wording speeches. So in terms of organizing and outlining, probably one of the most important things you need to do with a speech is the preparation. It is easier to remember if you have outlined and organized because you've already put some effort into the construction of the speech, which means it's easier to present, which means that it will increase your credibility and make you more persuasive. So there are lots of reasons for doing this. Now, in terms of organization and outlining, there are lots of different ways that you could go about doing this. The good news is that you've probably had some experience doing this with college papers. So you may be familiar with the term thesis. That's the central point or the central idea that you are going to be discussing or writing about. And the thing is, with your organizational plan, if you've ever confronted this with writing a paper, let's say, there are many different ways to organize different topics. One is not necessarily better than another. You do always have to have, though, an introduction, which is a beginning. And for us, this would be where you greet your audience. Your body. This is the midsection, and this is where you give your evidence and your details. I believe the Toastmasters video calls it the discussion section. And then finally, the conclusion. This is where you give closure, and basically you say goodbye to your audience. So, many times in terms of thinking about an organizational plan, you're thinking about your audience. What plan or what organizational pattern would make the most sense for your audience or your reader to understand what you're saying? But you're also thinking about the topic, the thing that you're talking about. What organizational plan makes sense for your particular topic? And you're also thinking about yourself. You might have preferences or strengths and weaknesses that might influence which organizational plan you choose. And it's not as if you're choosing one over another. You can oftentimes mix and match. But you'll see in the notes below, I've indicated some very common organizational plans that I suspect that you yourself have probably utilized in the past. Chronological, and this is in the third section below where it says organizational plan. Time order. This is particularly good when you're trying to teach somebody something because you're usually trying to teach them in steps, and the previous step influences the following step. Topical or categories. So there could be several categories that you discuss in no particular order. Or you can put them in order of importance. So you might make determinations about those categories that one category is more important than the other, and perhaps you would put that first. Or perhaps you would put that last. And there are advantages and disadvantages to both. If you put the most important first, obviously you are going to impress your audience or your reader, but they may become disappointed as the rest of your presentation or the rest of your writing continues because your other arguments aren't as strong. However, you might want to end with your most important argument because ultimately we are likely to be left with a very strong impression. But are you going to be able to hold on to our attention until we get to the ending? So there are pros and cons. Organizing things spatially by location, particularly if you're trying to describe something, what something looks like, that can be very helpful. Or causal relationships where one thing can cause on another, cause and effect. But we have to be careful with that because sometimes there are outside variables that influence cause and effect. I oftentimes give the example of a real estate agent who is trying to sell a piece of property. And they realize that in order to sell this property, there are lots of considerations they need to take into account. The first being the property itself, and that ultimately this property will have strengths and weaknesses, and you as the real estate agent are going to want to highlight strengths and to minimize weaknesses. But you are also going to think about the customer, the person who's viewing the property, and what is going to be important to them and tailor it to them. Or another way of thinking about that, you are tailoring to your audience. And you also want to think about yourself and what are your strengths in terms of selling or persuading or presenting information. So if we were to go through some of these organizational patterns, if we were to do something from a chronological perspective, this would work very well if you had a very old piece of property that had a lot of history associated with it. So you could talk about how it was on the National Historic Registry and talk a little bit about its historical relevance and how it's changed hands over time. This would also work particularly well for new construction, something no one had ever lived in before. I don't know if it would work well for a piece of property that's, let's say, 40 years old. It's not new nor old. That might not be chronological, that is, might not be the best way to describe that property. But how about topical? That there are three elements, let's say, that you want to highlight about this property. The first is the location of the property. As they say in real estate, location, location, location is everything. Secondly, you wanted to talk about the new roof that was put on. And thirdly, you wanted to talk about the price reduction that was just instituted for this property. And you might see them as being all equal, but you might see one as being more important than another. And then if that's the case, if you're going to put them in order of importance, do you put the most important one first, or do you put the most important one last? And note that something that's considered important could be subjective. So one family who's viewing the house might think that the neighborhood is the most important because of, let's say, school districts. However, a first-time homeowner might be more interested in price point and the fact that there was a price reduction. So again, it can vary. If you think about spatial, imagine describing this property that when you walk into the house, immediately to your left is a living room, and right in front of you is a small staircase that goes into a kitchen. Immediately to the right is a small bedroom that could be used as a den, perhaps. And then to the left is a dining room off of the kitchen. And then off of that dining room are some sliding glass doors to a deck. Now, you've never been in this home, but my description of the home helps you visualize what the home might look like. So what I'm doing is I'm giving you a spatial image. So there are lots of different ways that you could go about presenting information. Some suggestions, things that tend to arouse audience interest. Familiarity. Things that are familiar to us oftentimes grab our attention. This is a trick that's oftentimes used in math classes that you might have seen, that you talk about the familiar first, what's already known, before you introduce new information. Questions. Questions tend to engage the audience, even if they're just rhetorical questions, questions for which you had no expectation of an answer. You never know how an audience might respond, though. I always think about a question that I asked early on in my career, my Shakespeare class. I meant it to be rhetorical. It was about the play A Midsummer Night's Dream, and that's a play about people falling in and out of love because they're being manipulated through fairies and magic juice. And it turns out that the Queen of the Fairies, who's one of the most beautiful and high-ranking characters in the play, falls in love, granted through magical manipulation, with the lowest level and most base character of the play, who's aptly named Bottom, because he is at the bottom of the social scale. And through magic, he's been turned into an ass because he's been acting like an ass. So he's been turned into a donkey or an ass. And my rhetorical question, because sometimes students have some difficulty understanding, even with magic, how could a fairy fall in love with a literal and figurative ass? My rhetorical question was, well, how many of us have ever fallen in love with an ass? And I expected a few snickers or a bit of giggling to, again, illustrate my point that Shakespeare is about timeless and universal themes, but instead I got participation where people wanted to talk about specific love relationships and their partners being, in effect, asses, which was fine because it goes to show Shakespeare's relevance. But you never know how an audience might respond. Now, of course, we are presenting online, and that is very different in that you aren't going to have an audience's response. So speaking into a camera is a very different kind of situation because you're not going to get the audience feedback. If you find this to be very difficult, what some people have done is that they've actually had humans, friends, family, whatever, sit as audience while you are recording, and you can have them out of sight of the camera, so that at least what you can do is to use their cues, both verbal and nonverbal. After a while, I can tell you, it becomes much more comfortable speaking to a camera, and what you want to do is try to anticipate how your typical person would respond. Again, that comes with practice. And you also want to anticipate the kinds of questions someone might ask, because again, if you're performing in front of a camera, they don't have the opportunity to ask questions. Though certainly you can invite questions and ask people to put them in something like the comments below. So it's just adapting to the situation at hand. Problem solution. This works very nicely for a persuasive speech, which we will be doing at the ending of the semester, because you want to illustrate that there's some sort of issue or problem that can be rectified or at least alleviated on some level through your particular suggestions. Or even a process of elimination where you go through all of the options and the option that you're left with is obviously the point of your speech. So, as I had indicated, the speaking outline is going to be quite important because the speaking outline is going to give you direction. Think of it as your map. And I can tell you that in English classes, when you write a written outline, you want to try to be detailed because the more information you have, the less writing you have to do. It's the exact opposite with giving a speech. Less is more. You want, as the Toastmasters video indicated, key words and phrases so that if all goes well, you don't even have to refer to your outline because you're so familiar with the subject matter. But if you were to lose focus, you could look down very quickly and see your outline. This is a place where you can list stage directions. So if you wanted to show the audience, let's say a visual, you could actually write that to yourself. I've even had students write as stage directions in their outlines. Breathe, to remind themselves to breathe. One of the most important things you can do to help reduce nerves, by the way, to breathe in deeply. And the textbook gives you examples of outlines. One of them, if you're using the edition of the book I ordered for the class, is on page 119 about drunk driving. And I can tell you that that example is much too detailed for the delivery of a speech. It's a terrific example for a textbook because if you were to read the outline, you basically have the speech in its entirety. But that's not going to be terribly helpful if you're delivering and then you need to look down and find your place because you don't want to lose contact with the audience or, in this instance, with the camera. You want to talk to the camera as if you were talking to a person. So, if you're curious as to how I write outlines, just look at the notes below these videos. These are literally my outlines. I have a paper copy right here in front of me of what you have listed underneath your video. So in the event that I were to forget what it was that I should discuss, I could briefly look down, see my place, look up again, and continue. So I've got keywords and phrases, and then I fill the rest in with unscripted material. This might seem a bit odd to you, constructing it in this way, but you can always work backwards. I've had students tell me that they are very comfortable writing papers, but they aren't comfortable speaking. My suggestion is write out a paper, an autobiographical paper, and then reduce that paper and reduce it and reduce it until you've got keywords and phrases. So basically, when you are presenting your speech, you're just telling us what your paper was about. I give the same advice or similar advice, but in terms of writing, in my writing classes that I've got students who say I'm very uncomfortable with writing, but I'm much more comfortable speaking. So I suggest to them record what it is that you would say in a paper, transcribe that into words, and what you've got is a working draft of your paper that you would just need to polish. So it could work either way. I recommend that you have something physical in front of you rather than using an outline that's electronic, because if there were some sort of mechanical failure, then you've also lost your outline. So I think having something physical in front of you is also very important. Some people like note cards, some people like pieces of paper. Again, it's personal preference. Some people like to write on the fronts and backs of paper. Some people like just to write on the fronts of papers. I do recommend, if you're using note cards, that you number the note cards. In the event that they were to get out of order, you could easily put them into order again. So there are lots of different ways to go about this. You do not want to read your speech. In other words, you do not want to write a paper and read it word for word in front of your audience. That you don't want. It'll sound monotone. Again, you want to be conversational, as if you were giving as if you were having a conversation with a group of individuals. Nothing that's memorized, and we will talk about those sorts of speeches next week, the memorized speech. And that does have its place, but usually it's for very short and very important events for which there's little or no room for error. Something like, let's say, a television broadcast where it has to be down to the second. So again, your outline should be keywords and phrases, and I'm going to ask to see your outline. In the real world, you wouldn't share your outline with your audience. But since this is a kind of workshop situation, I want to be able to peek at your outline. So when we get to the point where you are actually posting your speech, I'm going to ask you to send a PDF of your outline to my email, which would be ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu, so I could quickly review the outline and then give you some feedback. I'm going to evaluate that outline informally on a checkmark system. So a plus would be excellent, a check plus would be very good, a check would be satisfactory. It's also less than satisfactory and unsatisfactory. And from my opinions and my experience, I might give you some suggestions of things you might want to consider with your outlines. But outlines are similar to note-taking. They can be very individual. We all do it in very different ways. And again, if you've constructed a good outline, you might not even need to reference it. Don't assume that just because you've written something on the outline that you need to follow it word for word. Think of it as your map, but you can deviate from that map. No one's going to know if you deviate from your outline. it's somewhat dangerous because once you deviate from your outline, then you're in unknown territory. It's almost like not listening to the GPS in your car. You can do that, but again, there could be consequences to doing that. But no one sees your outline but you, so you can deviate from it. I liken the outline to the net a trapeze artist would use, in that a trapeze artist would be silly not to use a net because something could go wrong. That said, a good trapeze artist doesn't fall, so they don't need the net, usually. But it only takes once, doesn't it, for an accident to occur. So that's why you've got the net, and that's why you've got the outline. I would like to see the outline you actually use. I know you might be tempted to construct two outlines. One outline for me of the key words and phrases, and another outline for you where you get to read. No, no, no. You want to deliver with just those key words and phrases. You want to have a conversation. I also know that since we're recording speeches, you might be tempted to do editing. No editing, one take. Now, that said, you can make as many takes as you like before you post, but remember, there is no such thing as the perfect speech. So if you're going for perfection, you could record literally 1,000 times and it still won't be perfect. That's not what we're looking for. We're looking for you being able, in the moment, to be able to present information. So if you needed to, you could record something in 1 or 2 takes. If you needed to, you could present live via Zoom. So keep that in mind. This is not a class in editing. This is a class in public speaking. So some of the advantages of having that outline is that it helps with your memory, and it also helps with the audience's memory because you're likely to be much more organized. And just like we tend to have poor listening skills, we also have poor memory skills. How poor? Pretty poor. Studies have shown that we can remember plus to minus 7 items, sometimes as few as plus or minus 3 items. Minus 3 items is 2 or 1. That's quite sad that we can remember so few things. Now, obviously, we are remembering more because there are all kinds of techniques that we utilize to improve our memory. For instance, chunking, where we group like items together. This is very common with phone numbers, for instance. We don't usually think of phone numbers as separate digits. We think of the first 3 numbers as being 1 unit, for instance, 775 rather than 775, or 1,000 rather than 1000, which happens to be the phone number for GCC, by the way. So that's it. Something else that we do is called mnemonics. And I suspect you've probably been doing it naturally, whether you even realize you've been doing it or not. Memory tricks or memory devices to help you remember things. For instance, utilizing acronyms, which is when you take the first letter of each word of the thing you're trying to remember, and all of those first letters form a new word. This is oftentimes used in math classes, science classes, so that you can remember large, complex pieces of information. But even in English classes, I think of the first rule of writing is KISS, which is an acronym for Keep It Simple. I say silly. Some people say stupid. It seems a bit harsh. But again, that word is an acronym for the first letter of all of the words in the phrase that I'm trying to remember. Songs, jingles, the mind usually remembers those much more easily. Repetition. I remember in high school I had a teacher who said that repetition is the key to learning. And he was quite right. And while I don't necessarily remember very much about that course, I do remember him saying repetition is the key to learning because he would say that over and over and over again. And I think about, how poor my memory is. My memory's always been quite poor, especially for things like phone numbers, addresses, names, things of that nature. And yet, there's a phone number that I've got firmly embedded in my mind, 867-5309. And if you are a music aficionado, you know that is a pop song from the 80s that was redone years later. I won't sing it to you. I'll spare you that. But 8675309 is in my head, and not necessarily the phone numbers of family or friends are in my head, which just goes to show that repetition and music can be incredibly powerful. So, beginning and ending speeches. There is something called the primary recency effect, that we tend to remember best what we hear and what we see first, and we remember best what we hear and see last. That means introductions and conclusions, beginnings and endings are particularly important because they are likely to be remembered by the audience. We are going to see some sample student speeches soon, autobiographical speeches from students like yourselves, but in no way affiliated with GCC, that we could use as kind of examples or models as we are putting together our own speeches. My suspicion is that when you watch these speeches, which are posted on YouTube, so I'm assuming that they are available for public consumption, that you will remember best the beginning and the ending of the speech, illustrating the primary recency effect. Or if you've ever gone on a vacation, you want to try out this theory, chances are you remember best the beginning and the ending of the vacation, not necessarily the middle. But there are lots of different ways to begin and end, and I suspect you've probably utilized many of these with writing a paper. That's the good news. So you can see this under Chapter 8 in the notes below in the second section, beginning and ending techniques. Talking about something that's real, reality, that's likely to get an audience's attention, and that's a good way to begin or end. Something that's nearby is a good way to get an audience's attention. Proximity, a good way to begin or end. Something that's familiar, also another great way to get an audience's attention. So I think about my own experience when I'm scanning the news. If there is a news article about education, because education is something that's familiar to me and near and dear to me, I'm likely to stop and pay attention to it, especially if it's about higher education, because that's the area of education that I'm involved with. And if it's about GCC itself, I'll stop and read the whole thing, even if that means I might be late, because that is the most real to me. That is the nearest to me, and that's the most familiar to me. So that's obviously going to engage my interest the most. Suspense and conflict are other things that tend to engage audiences. Again, newsrooms are quite aware of this, and they oftentimes use suspense and conflict in the reporting of the news in order to get our attention. Humor needs to be done carefully because humor can be misinterpreted. Humor is often individual. It's also often culturally based, so we'll talk about culture soon as well. Just stating that something is important will alert the audience to pay more attention. That's something that you could do at the beginning or the end. Question answer, as I was suggesting earlier, even a rhetorical question, chances are your audience is likely to engage. A quotation. The quotation should be relevant to what it is you're discussing. And there are lots of resources you can use for finding quotations. As we will talk about with the web, that going on Google and going into the first web link that you're given is not necessarily the best way to find information, because you know that information can be distorted and manipulated on the web. There is a resource, you might have heard of it before, called Bartlett's Familiar Quotations. It works much like a dictionary, like Webster's, for instance, where it's organized by topic in alphabetical order. And under those topics, you'll find famous quotations. So if you wanted to find a quote about love, you would look under L and you would find lots of quotes. Perhaps one would be applicable for a beginning or an ending of speech, or even in the middle. But since we're talking about beginnings and endings in particular, I always remember I had a student who did this, and it was a rather lengthy quote, which is fine, but they began the speech with the quote and didn't tell us that they were going to be quoting. So we all assumed, because they were reading the quote, because you want to be exact with your quote, we all assumed they were going to read the entire speech, and that would probably be disastrous. That's not what happened. After they finished reading the quote, they told us that they were done with the quote and they proceeded with the speech. But I do remember the suggestion that I gave to this student, that if they were going to literally begin the speech with a quote, they could greet the audience, hi, and then say, let me begin with a quote, so that we would be aware of what was going to be going on. And keep that in mind, that at the beginning of the speech, you do want to greet your audience. It gives your audience an opportunity to settle a little bit, and it gives you an opportunity to settle. And at the end, you want to give some closure. You want to thank your audience and find a way to say goodbye to your audience. Storytelling, very powerful. People love stories. The story needs to be related to the subject matter that you're discussing, but that's a great way to begin or end. Personal reference, people tend to be very interested in speakers. So even if you aren't necessarily giving an autobiographical speech, making some sort of reference to yourself. So I wouldn't be surprised if you made a reference to yourself in your informative or even your persuasive speech. A startling statement. You need to be careful with this kind of thing, but if you can shock your audience, I can't remember if I told you this story. I don't think I did. And it was about a speech I heard many years ago. It was a face-to-face class, an evening class. And it was during the break. It was a long class. So we would take a break in the middle of the class. And basically, we were nearing the ending of the break. I was organizing my notes. Other people were basically eating, because usually that's what people did during the break, is that they'd get a little snack or something to drink, so forth and so on. And I heard, I wasn't even looking because I was organizing my notes, at the back of the class, someone beginning to choke. And a million and one thoughts ran through my mind. I've got to get to this person. I need to call 911. I need to get public safety. Do I remember the Heimlich maneuver? Well, at any rate, again, time seemed to freeze, but I made it as far as standing up from my desk at the front of the room before another student approached the choking student, performed the Heimlich, and out of the choking student's mouth popped a rolled ball of paper. Quite surreal. We're all staring at this paper. And then the person who performed the Heimlich, that student walked calmly to the front of the room. It just so happened that he was scheduled to deliver his speech next after the break. And he announced to us that what we had witnessed was a simulation. But if it had been real, would we have known what to do? And that his speech was going to be about performing the Heimlich. And it was brilliant because this speaker took a subject that could be considered rather dull and dry, and he made it relevant and interesting and engaging because of that simulation. And yes, there was a little bit of risk involved. He had worked out everything ahead of time with one of his friends in the class, that the friend would pretend to joke. When no one was looking, they'd put paper in their mouth. And then, of course, the speaker would pretend to perform the Heimlich, and the choking victim, so to speak, would spit out that rolled ball of paper. Imagine if, let's say, the speaker hadn't reached the choking victim in time and another student had instead and actually performed the Heimlich. When you perform the Heimlich for real, you can actually break ribs. Or imagine if that supposed choking victim actually began to choke, and the student who is pretending to perform the Heimlich doesn't perform the Heimlich, and the student was in true distress. So lots of things could have happened. Luckily, again, it was all very well planned, so it was a calculated risk and a speech I'll never forget throughout the course of my career. Forecasting and summarizing. Sometimes just telling your audience what it is you're going to talk about or write about, then talking about it or writing about it, and then reminding us what you talked about or what you wrote about. So that is a good way to begin and to end. So there are lots of different ways that you can go about doing that, the beginnings and endings. And I wanted to lastly talk about wording your speeches. Now, we've been talking about conversational speeches, so that you don't necessarily want to have your speech done word for word. So you want to be not only conversational, but chances are you're using simpler vocabulary, you're using shorter sentences, and you're much less formal. Very different from writing, where you want to be very precise about your language. Now, that said, once you are comfortable with delivering speeches, you can take more and more risk, if you will, with playing with language. We think about some of the great speakers of our time, someone like Martin Luther King, who usually, his speech, I Have a Dream, is ranked in the top 10 of the best speeches ever given, usually in the top place, actually. using things like symbolism and metaphor and rhyme and alliteration and all of these literary techniques. I mean, those are the literary greats when they are delivering oration. We can aspire to that, but we're not held to that level. We just want to be clear, and we want to be able to communicate with the viewer or with the audience. But once you do get comfortable and want to play with language a little bit, I wanted to talk about some ways that you could use language. For instance, definitions. Now, you can give just your typical dictionary definition. That's known as a denotation. Keep in mind, though, that words have different connotations, associations behind them. So you can have two words that have the same dictionary definition, the same denotation. Cheap and frugal, for instance. You don't spend a lot of money, but have very different connotations. Frugal is seen as positive and that you are showing intelligence in the way you spend your money. Cheap is viewed as stingy and something that's negative. In fact, talking about negative, you can do a negative definition. A definition is usually what something is. A negative definition could be what something is not. So, for instance, I could say something like wealth is not financial success, but health and happiness. So I've just defined what wealth is not. And again, you're not likely to find this in a dictionary definition. Probably wealth would be defined by financial success. But I just said that my definition of wealth is not about financial success. It's about health and about happiness. Definition is also influenced by context, how you're using the word in that particular situation. And one word can mean one thing in one context and another thing in another context. Take a word like brief, for instance, where if we were to use this word, let's say in a writing class, probably we're talking about being concise, be brief in your writing. But if I were using this word in a law class and I was talking about a brief, I'm probably talking about a legal report. And if this were in a fashion class, I would be talking about a brief as an article of clothing. So again, same word, multiple definitions depending on context. Some of the advanced techniques that I was suggesting earlier, using things like imagery, anything that involves the senses of your audience, it helps with their visualization. Advertisements do this very well. So if you've ever had the experience of, let's say, watching a television commercial about food or drink, and you weren't thirsty or hungry before the commercial, but you are after the commercial, then you will know how well they utilize the appeal to the senses, where you could hear the sounds of the ice cubes popping, and you can see the drops of dew on the glass, and so forth and so on. Metaphor. This is comparing two dissimilar things. And you don't use the words like or as. If you use like or as, that's known as a simile. So saying something like cold as ice, that's a simile. But if you wanted to say, I am ice, or I remember a speech I heard, it was actually a sample speech, an autobiographical speech, where the speaker was comparing themselves to the color red. And the speaker didn't say, I'm like red, which would be a simile. The speaker said, I am red. And that's a metaphor comparing two dissimilar things. Actually, it was a very clever speech because they went through and talked about all of the associations with the color red and how those associations could also be applicable to themselves. However, which can happen when you're using language in advanced ways, they tended to lose control of this metaphor as the speech continued. So after a while, it was pretty difficult to follow. The first comparisons made a lot of sense, that red can be associated with anger or with passion. By the time they started talking about the car battery terminals and red, it became a little bit more difficult to follow. So you want to be careful when you're doing things like that. Rhyme, which is when the endings of words have very similar sounds. Or alliteration, when the beginnings of words have very similar sounds. And again, I think about the great orators of our time, and they're able to use all of these literary techniques as well as to be able to communicate effectively. And while that's ideal, remember, there is no such thing as the perfect speech, and we do not have to deliver the greatest speech ever delivered in the history of time. The idea is that we are improving our skills and that we are communicating to our audience. In this instance, you are communicating to an online audience through video. So your language should be audience centered. It should be appropriate to your audience. So obviously, if you're speaking to a group of children, your language will be much more simplistic than it would be if you were speaking to a group of adults, let's say. And you should try to be as neutral as possible in your language. You want to try to be as culturally sensitive and inclusive in your language within reason. Because I know that when we're speaking in the moment, we oftentimes don't have as much ability to be precise with our language in the way we would when we were writing. So when I'm writing, I do talk about the postal carrier. But honestly, when I'm waiting for the mail, I ask if the mailman has arrived yet, which is particularly problematic because not only is that a gender-specific term, but the person who delivers the mail is female. So you do know that mail carrier, or I hope you know that mail carrier is the preferred term because it's gender neutral. And we're not even talking about something like pronouns, which have become particularly problematic because we tend to see the world in binary ways. It's a he or a she. What if it's both or neither? So now pronouns are under great scrutiny. In the past, they were under scrutiny because he was the default pronoun for both masculine and feminine. So a doctor examines his patients. And of course, that could be seen as very gender specific. And the argument was that the implied message was that only males could be doctors. So ideally, what you do is you put it in the plural. Doctors should examine their patients because in the plural, there is no gender specificity. Some argued you could say his, her, but then his comes before her. You could say her, his, but then her comes before his. And if you're sitting there counting the number of times that you're using her, his, as opposed to his, her, I'm saying you're wasting probably your time because the major point is to communicate, not necessarily to be so afraid of making a mistake in your language that you're no longer able to communicate. But you try to be culturally sensitive and as inclusive and neutral as possible in your language. And sometimes if you make an error, I can tell you it might be better not to correct it than to correct it. It just depends on the situation. I've noticed this with errors that I've made in terms of content, something that's very clearly an error. So I might state something like the wrong date to a class. And chances are they realize that I just made a mistake. But if I try to correct it with another date, and that also is an incorrect date, and then I become confused as to what the date really is, well, now I've just drawn attention to my error and made things much worse. It would have been better if I had just left it alone and just let the audience assume that I had made an error about the particular date, but that I knew what the date was, rather than drawing attention to the fact of the error itself. But again, you have to think about the situation. And certainly you don't want to use deliberately offensive language or language that can be misinterpreted as being offensive. So, what happens with us next week? We get to finish up, or close to finish up, the textbook, believe it or not, with 3 chapters. We get to talk about the actual delivery of speeches, because it isn't just the content, it's the performance. We get to talk about culture and some of the ways that culture can influence the way we give and receive messages. And we also get to talk about audience and how audience influences speakers. After that, we will have a quiz and also a practice session where I had indicated that for our practice session, I'm asking that each of you contact me about your upcoming speech. And you can do so via email. It can be very brief, just telling me what your topic is going to be. But it also is a place where you can ask questions. It's also an opportunity for you to set up a Zoom appointment or a phone appointment with me if you so prefer, where we could talk about the speech in depth, and you could even deliver the speech for me ahead of time and I can give you some feedback. So you can think of me as a kind of tutor in this instance, and I can give you as much or as little feedback as you would like. And then the week after that, we are posting our first speech. But first, I wanted to make sure that we talked about delivering speeches, cultural challenges, and audience, because all of those will be relevant for not just this first speech, which of course is my primary objective, but the speeches that occur afterwards. So where we are now is our class attendance question. That would be due on Saturday at 6 p.m. on the 11th of February. Feel free to ask me for an extension if you need additional time. And your question is about upcoming speech 1. What do you think will be your biggest challenge delivering speech number 1, the autobiographical speech, and why? So I'm looking forward to read your responses. Again, you don't have to answer your peers if you don't care to, but you should read all of your peers' responses and my responses in turn. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next week. Take care. Bye-bye.